He once said destiny doesn't arrive on red carpets. It sneaks in through side doors and kitchen lights at 3 a.m. James Brolin learned that the hard way. The man who rebuilt himself after 1,000 quiet rejections, who found home in the last place Hollywood ever looks inside a steady heart, now guards the one story he refuses to sell. The long, stubborn love that turned noise into music. For 27 years, he and Barbra Streisand have lived a marriage that tabloids could never quite photograph. They kept their worlds separate enough to breathe, close enough to matter. She fought for women's hearts in hospital corridors bearing her name. He learned that the bravest role isn't a doctor on primetime TV, but the man who warms tea before dawn and reads a hand-scribbled lyric like scripture. The spotlight can make promises. Real life keeps them. Lately, the whispers grow teeth. Not headlines echoes, meetings postponed, projects declined, doors that once opened automatically are now gently closed from the inside. Maybe it's age, maybe it's choice, or maybe it's the lesson only time can teach two battle-worn souls. When the world grows loud, love turns the volume down. You can measure a career in awards and box office. You can only measure a life in the small, unglamorous rituals that no one sees. Two mugs cooling on a desk of sheet music, a note taped to a lamp. Back soon, save the page. A quiet promise that tomorrow will be ordinary and therefore sacred. And if a final curtain is coming someday, they will meet it the way they met everything else. Side by side, palms open, unafraid. The miracle of this story isn't fame, it's the price they paid to protect what fame could never buy. James Brolin did not arrive as a comet. He accumulated brick by bruised brick until a man you could trust stood where a wanderer once slept in the backseat of a car. He became the physician America relied on in Marcus Welby, MD, the moral center in a world that kept trying to tilt. Awards followed, then the strange quiet that always trails applause. He learned that recognition is a fickle tide. Character is a shoreline. Barbra Streisand came at life from the opposite horizon, searing, undeniable, a gale that bent the trees and then replanted the forest. She sang her way out of a one-room childhood and into a century's imagination. She produced when producers said no, directed when directors scoffed, and turned refusal into a renewable fuel. Funny Girl, The Way We Were. A star is born not just hits, but homelands. When institutions left doors half shut, she built new rooms and invited history in. By the mid-1990 seconds, both had everything and somehow still lacked a place to set it down. He had steadiness without a sanctuary. She had power without rest. They met because fate likes ordinary disguises. A dinner arranged by friends, jokes traded like poker chips, the famous quip about his hair that could have ended the conversation but instead unlocked it. He didn't hear insult. He heard honesty. She didn't see posture. She saw presence. And for two people whose lives had been measured in noise, the rarest luxury was candor spoken at a human volume. What grew between them was not spectacle. It was a practice. Separate finances so neither vanished into the other. Shared rituals so neither had to stand alone at the cliff's edge of aging. He learned the tempo of her writing days, the way a page feels like a tide coming in. She learned the quiet temperature of his focus, how an actor's preparation is mostly invisible, like roots threading the dark. They were not trying to impress. They were building a room where both could breathe. There were public chapters, the wedding that made headlines, the projects that churned, the photographs that said, "Look, they are thriving." And then there was the private book that mattered more. The board-stiff mornings, tea steaming and mismatched mugs. The evenings when she drafted a melody and he read it aloud to hear where the heart stuttered. The long, unhurried walks that solved nothing and somehow solved everything. The world calls it domestic life, as if ordinary were a lesser species. They called it home. To understand the stakes of this story, you have to understand their deserts. His, the early years of hunger, the nightly crawl back to that car that smelled of tin and weather. The way rejection became a second language, eventually softening into resolve. Hers, a childhood squared off by absence, the long apprenticeship in being unseen, the armor of excellence welded over a fault line of fear. No tabloid can photograph the wound that made the song. No highlight reel remembers the nights someone nearly quit. Together, they became a rarer thing in Hollywood, two careers refusing to devour a marriage refusing to devour two souls. He took roles that let him be present. She took stands that made presence feel like a cause. Between them, a thesis. Endurance requires design. You do not stumble into a 25th anniversary. You build toward it, one unglamorous mercy at a time. And now, in the long gold of later life, they practice a different kind of ambition. The ambition to remain gentle. Doors are closed with care. Invitations are weighed against the calendar of a human heart. When the day asks too much, they answer with less. It is not retreat, it is mastery. To choose what matters when the world keeps offering more is the last hardest art. This is the ground we stand on before the deeper descent, the boy who learned to breathe through failure until breath itself became a vow, and the girl who turned abandonment into an orchestra. Only then does the marriage make sense. Two long roads that were never going to end until they finally met. To see how this patience was forged, we have to go back to the hot July room where Craig Kenneth Brolin took his first fragile breaths, and to the Brooklyn apartment where a young Barbra taught herself to sing past the silence. Long before the cameras found him, before the scripts and sets, James Brolin was just Craig Kenneth Brolin, a boy trying to breathe in a city that barely noticed him. Los Angeles, in the 1,940 seconds, wasn't the land of dreams yet. It was a furnace. The July air was thick with heat and ambition. His father, Henry, a stern contractor with sunburned hands and a voice like gravel, believed discipline was the only language worth teaching. His mother, Helen, had once danced near the edge of fame, an extra in silent films who'd learned how quickly a dream can turn to dust. They didn't sing lullabies, they built routines. At 4, Craig had a chore chart pinned beside his bed, each box a reminder that love was earned through order. Every Sunday, Henry would inspect the list, like an officer reviewing troops, rewarding perfection with a nod and punishing mistakes with silence. That silence carved deep. It taught the boy that approval was rarer than warmth, and warmth was a thing that had to be imagined. At 7, his lungs betrayed him. Asthma hit like a slow suffocation, and the boy who couldn't sit still suddenly couldn't stand. 45 days trapped in a hospital room where the air smelled of bleach and fear. No visitors, no bedtime stories, only the rhythm of machines and his own thin breathing. It felt, he would later say, like my body was trying to erase me. But when he finally walked out of that room, pale and trembling, something inside him had hardened into resolve. Pain had made space for patience. By 9, he discovered precision. He dismantled his father's wristwatch, cleaned each cog with trembling hands, and rebuilt it perfectly. Henry didn't say a word, but for Craig, that unspoken approval was gold. He began to collect moments of silence like trophies, the pauses before a teacher said, "Well done," the quiet after finishing a task right. He learned early that achievement could be armor. Then came 1955, the year everything changed. He was 15 when he first saw East of Eden. The moment James Dean leaned into rebellion on screen, Craig's breath caught again, not from asthma, but awe. He saw something of himself in that wounded defiance, that mix of anger and ache. For 6 months, he became a pilgrim of imitation, riding his bike 17 miles to Griffith Park every Saturday just to whisper Dean's lines to the trees. He wasn't chasing fame. He was practicing belief. When Dean died later that same year, Craig didn't cry. He simply stopped speaking. For 11 days, he lived in silence, eating, breathing, existing, but not talking. It was as if the universe had confirmed his worst suspicion. Even the bright ones don't make it out alive. Yet within that silence, something alchemical occurred. His grief became ignition. A teacher, recognizing the strange gravity of the boy, found one of his homemade short films and sent it, secretly, to UCLA. It won an honorable mention from Nicholas Ray, Dean's own director. For the first time, Craig's dream had been seen by someone who mattered. Still, the dream didn't protect him from the old ghosts. Fear shadowed every audition, every handshake. Rejection wasn't a stranger, it was family. His father's voice lingered in his head. "You're not enough yet." The lesson stuck like splinters under the skin. He failed often, spectacularly, and learned to hide the bruises with a smile. Behind each closed door, he rehearsed again. Behind each "no," he whispered another line into the dark. That stubbornness, born of silence and solitude, became his anchor. By his 20s, the name James Brolin replaced Craig Brolin, not as disguise, but as declaration. The boy who once disassembled watches now disassembled his past, piece by piece, until he could rebuild himself as something new. He had endured hospitals, hunger, and humiliation, and still found the nerve to look the camera dead in the eye and pretend he belonged there. Far across the continent, another child was learning how to turn loneliness into light. Brooklyn, 1943. Barbra Jones Streisand was born into absence. Her father, Emmanuel, died when she was just 15 months old, a medical mistake during a seizure. Her mother, Diana, retreated inward, medicated and mourning, leaving her children to grow up in a house thick with unspoken grief. Barbara's earliest memories were filled not with lullabies but with echoes, the sound of a mother moving through silence, the vibration of a city too busy to care. When Diana remarried, the stepfather brought walls instead of warmth. There was no privacy, no room of her own, no corner to dream. For years, she slept beside her mother and brother, staring at cracked paint and whispering stories to herself. She once said she envied closets not for what they held, but for how they closed. At 16, she walked out of that apartment with a small suitcase and a voice that no one had ever truly heard. Her mother brought soup, but not encouragement. Friends called her strange, teachers called her unteachable. But beneath that awkward exterior, a storm was forming. When she sang, the room changed temperature. It wasn't polish, it was necessity. Every note was a cry for space. The girl who had been invisible turned her pain into an instrument. Choir rehearsals became confessionals. When she couldn't afford lessons, she studied echoes, listening to Judy Garland and Billie Holiday, tracing their phrasing until her own began to bloom. A music teacher once said her voice held ache and authority, a contradiction that would define her entire life. When Barbra sang, she wasn't chasing applause. She was chasing belonging. Each lyric was a plea. Hear me, see me, let me exist. What James had learned through endurance, she learned through defiance. Both carried the same hunger, but fed it differently. He through structure, she through rebellion. Decades later, when they met, neither would say it aloud, but they recognized each other instantly, not as strangers meeting for the first time, but as survivors of the same quiet war. To understand how those wounded children transformed into legends and how the ghosts of their past followed them into fame, we must step into the dazzling, treacherous dawn of Hollywood itself. By the early 1960 seconds, Los Angeles was reinventing itself, a mirage of neon dreams and new money shimmering against smog-stained skies. For James Brolin, it wasn't a city of stars. It was a gauntlet. Every audition line stretched around the block, a parade of perfect faces wearing the same hope. He had no famous relatives, no connections, no safety net, just a thin wallet, a thicker skin, and the kind of hunger that makes failure feel like oxygen. He tried everything: bit parts, background roles, even stand-ins for actors who didn't bother to show up. He learned to wait long hours in fluorescent hallways where producers barked names like drill sergeants. "You're not what we're looking for," they'd say, and he'd smile, nod, and go home to the only place that would have him, the back seat of his rusted Volkswagen Beetle, parked behind a 7-Eleven, the steering wheel doubling as a dinner table. For months, that car was his home, his classroom, his confessional. He read scripts under the glow of gas station lights and whispered lines to the windshield, rehearsing for a life that hadn't started yet. There were nights, he later admitted, when I'd eat beans cold from a can and imagine the applause was real. Every rejection carved him deeper, but it also refined him. Pain became practice, loneliness, discipline. He was cast in a background shot for Batman in 1965, then cut before it aired. It wasn't the first time his face disappeared in editing, but it hurt. Still, he refused to break. He studied Marlon Brando, Clint Eastwood, Montgomery Clift, men who carried silence like a weapon. If words failed him, maybe presence wouldn't. So, he worked on his stillness, his walk, his stare, his refusal to flinch. By 1966, he'd earned his first speaking part, a role so minor the paycheck couldn't cover rent. Midway through filming, the producer decided he didn't like Brolin's voice and fired him on the spot. He begged for half his pay, just enough for gas and food. They refused. That night, broke and humiliated, he sat in the car that had become his entire geography and whispered to himself, "Nothing can hurt more than not trying." It was the closest he'd come to quitting, and the moment he swore he never would. Fate, with its strange sense of humor, arrived through grease-stained fingers. One evening, he was helping a Universal Studios executive whose car had broken down. Brolin fixed the engine, wiped his hands on his jeans, and smiled. The executive asked what he did. "I act," James said simply. A week later, he was called in for a screen test. The role, Dr. Stephen Kiley in Marcus Welby, MD. He didn't understand the medical jargon, but he understood exhaustion, fragility, and fight. When the cameras rolled, he didn't perform. He inhabited. The producers saw it instantly, not a young actor, but a man who had survived something. The role became his rebirth. The show exploded into a hit. For the first time, James Brolin's name wasn't a punchline, it was a presence. The Emmy came soon after, a gold echo of every sleepless night spent whispering to himself in that car. I was this close to giving up, he said years later, holding two fingers barely apart. If I hadn't fixed that car, you'd be talking to a mechanic instead of an actor. It wasn't luck, it was endurance disguised as timing. With success came temptation. Fame demanded attention, and attention is rarely gentle. The lights brightened, the phone rang, and the invitations multiplied. But success didn't erase the shadows, it sharpened them. He worked constantly, chasing the momentum as if it could protect him from collapse. When Marcus Welby, MD, ended, he jumped from film to film: Skyjacked 1972, Westworld 1973, The Amityville Horror 1979. Each one an echo of something inside him. In Skyjacked, he played a soldier unraveling. In Westworld, a man hunted by his own creation. And in Amityville, a husband trapped in a haunted house that felt far too familiar. Hollywood called it acting. He called it exorcism. Every role was a way to bleed quietly. The more he succeeded, the lonelier he felt. His first marriage, already fragile, cracked beneath the weight of fame. He returned home to silence the same silence he'd known as a child, now magnified by distance. I was building a career, he later said, but watching my family crumble. The boy who had once begged for attention now begged for balance. Fame had saved him financially, but emotionally it came at full price. Still, he pressed on. The discipline drilled into him as a child became his armor. He wasn't loud, wasn't reckless. He showed up on time, delivered, disappeared. To Hollywood, that made him reliable. To himself, it made him invisible. He started directing, producing, searching for control in a world built on chaos. By the early 1980s, he found solace in television, again Hotel, where he not only starred but also directed several episodes. For the first time, applause didn't feel hollow. The work was fulfilling, the rhythm steady. The audience saw a leading man. He finally saw a craftsman. Meanwhile, across the continent, Barbra Streisand's rise had taken an entirely different shape, an explosion of sound and defiance. While James fought for a single role, she was rewriting what women could do in Hollywood, one audacious project at a time. But her success, too, came with loneliness. Perfectionism doesn't leave much room for peace. She carried her childhood emptiness into boardrooms and studios, filling the void with achievement until the applause felt like armor. They wouldn't meet for decades yet, but by then, their stories had been quietly preparing for each other. Both had fought to be seen. Both had suffered for their craft. And both were about to discover that love, real love, doesn't arrive in triumph. It arrives when the applause fades. The stage was set for fame's cruelest illusion, that once you're adored, you stop aching. In truth, for James Brolin and Barbra Streisand, the greatest trials were still ahead at the very height of their success. By the mid-1970s, James Brolin was the embodiment of the American leading man, stoic, steady, with eyes that hinted at storms just beneath the surface. Marcus Welby, MD, had turned him into a household name, a fixture in living rooms across the nation. Mothers adored him, fathers respected him, and Hollywood finally called him by his first name without checking the script. Yet behind the polished smile and the handshakes at studio parties, Brolin carried an exhaustion that success only deepened. Fame is not a rescue, it's a magnifier. The loneliness he'd once felt in the backseat of his car now followed him through five-star hotel rooms and movie sets. Everyone wanted a piece of him, but no one wanted the quiet man behind the camera flash. You learn fast in this business, he said once, that applause doesn't hug you back. Still, he gave the world what it wanted. He moved effortlessly from television heartthrob to box office draw, starring in thrillers like Skyjacked, where he played a war veteran unraveling under the pressure of command. In Westworld, where he faced down Yul Brynner's relentless machine, a metaphor for fame itself, merciless and mechanical. But it was the Amityville Horror in 1979 that burned his name into cinematic history. The role of George Lutz, a man haunted not by ghosts but by his own mind, felt uncomfortably close. During filming, something eerie happened. A book on set fell off a shelf without reason. Crew members laughed it off, but James didn't. It felt like a warning, he later admitted, half joking. The film became a massive hit, earning nearly $90 million on a $4 million budget. Overnight, Brolin became the face of terror, and yet, he was never truly afraid of haunted houses. He was afraid of emptiness, of coming home to applause that couldn't fill a silence. Through the 1,980 seconds, he sought refuge not in fame, but in control. Directing gave him purpose. Producing gave him peace. His series Hotel became his sanctuary, a set where he wasn't just acting, but building something stable. The cast adored him for his calm. Crew members said he was the eye of the storm. But stability didn't make headlines. He wasn't a scandal. He wasn't chaos. And in Hollywood, that can be its own kind of invisibility. By contrast, Barbra Streisand's star was blinding. While James mastered the art of quiet consistency, Barbra was rewriting the laws of show business. Her voice, haunting, technical, unrelenting, had evolved from Broadway brilliance to cinematic domination. Funny Girl had made her a star. The Way We Were made her a legend. And A Star Is Born made her immortal. In 1977, she became the first woman ever to win an Academy Award for Best Original Song with Evergreen. But the accolade didn't soothe her. Behind every standing ovation lurked an old ghost, the mother who never said, "I'm proud of you." Fame didn't silence that echo. It only amplified it. While others celebrated her dominance, Barbra was fighting a different war, one for creative control. She produced, directed, and wrote in an era when women weren't allowed to do all three. When studios told her no, she built her own empire brick by brick, willed by the same hunger that once made her sing to wallpaper in a Brooklyn apartment. 15 years she battled to make Yentl a film no studio wanted. She wrote it, directed it, financed it, lived it. When it finally premiered in 1983, she became the first woman to win a Golden Globe for Best Director. The Academy didn't nominate her. She smiled anyway. The absence was louder than applause, she said years later. It told me how far we still had to go. While James found refuge in direction and simplicity, Barbra found power in defiance and perfectionism. Both were ascending, but the higher they climbed, the thinner the air became. By the 1,990 seconds, their paths were circling closer. He was a respected veteran actor, dependable and admired. She was an institution more than a performer. She was an era. Yet both, for all their success, were haunted by the same shadow: solitude. James had marriages that had frayed under the weight of fame. Barbra had relationships that couldn't survive her strength. The public adored her, but love, real love, seemed to slip through her fingers. In 1994, after years away from the stage, Barbra returned for her one-night-only concert. The tickets sold out instantly, but the comeback was less a performance than a confession. She'd spent decades battling stage fright, the cruel irony of a woman whose power terrified even herself. When she finally walked out and sang, her voice cracked slightly on the first note. The audience leaned in. It was raw, imperfect, human, and more breathtaking than perfection could ever be. James watched from afar. He'd been through his own fire. The Hollywood machine, the reinventions, the quiet fade-outs between roles. Both were weary. Both were ready for something that didn't need to be earned. When they finally met in 1996, it didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like an arrival. He had steadiness. She had fire. He was a man of presence. She, a woman of command. Two people forged in entirely different furnaces, finally cooling in each other's shade. It wasn't about falling in love, he said later. It was about finding home. Hollywood called them unlikely. They called each other necessary. By the late 1,990 seconds, James Brolin and Barbra Streisand had everything: awards, acclaim, legacy. Yet, what made them truly remarkable wasn't what they'd achieved, but what they'd chosen: stillness. In an industry obsessed with youth, they chose longevity. In a world that worshipped noise, they chose quiet. And in a culture that mistook fame for fulfillment, they built a life that valued neither, only love. When asked what success meant to him after all these years, James simply smiled. "It's when you can look across the table," he said, "and see someone who makes you forget you ever needed to win." But every summit carries its storm. Just when peace seemed to settle in, The cracks began to whisper again. Health scares, aging, and the haunting truth that even love forged in fire must someday face the cold. It's a cruel trick of time. Just when life feels stable enough to breathe, it begins to slip through your fingers. For James, Brolin, and Barbra Streisand, the calm they had built together was not a pause in the story. It was the quiet before the ache. Hollywood had forgotten them for a while, but the world never really lets its legends rest. Fame has a way of circling back, not as applause, but as intrusion. When whispers began to swirl about Barbara's health, James stayed silent. Not out of denial, but devotion. "She's my whole world," he said softly once, "and you don't hand your world to the press." For over 2 decades, the two had lived on their own terms, separate bank accounts, separate routines, yet intertwined lives. Their independence had always been a strength, but when illness enters a marriage, it turns every private ritual into a prayer. He began turning down roles. A lucrative series offer gone. A $2 million film deal declined. "I can't commit," he told producers. Those words, once professional, now carried a different gravity. He wasn't talking about schedules. He was talking about presence. For the first time in years, the world noticed James not for a performance, but for an absence. The man who had built his identity around showing up was now choosing to stay home. It wasn't a retreat. It was a vigil. Hollywood called it retirement. He called it love. Behind the gates of their Malibu sanctuary, time moved differently. Their mornings began slowly, tea steaming between them. Barbara scribbling notes on a memoir she'd spent years writing, James adjusting her reading glasses and smiling when she pretended not to need them. The walls of their home were lined with scripts, albums, and awards, but those meant little now. What mattered was the sound of her laughter echoing down the hall, the rustle of paper when she turned a page, the simple proof that she was still here. But time, unrelenting, continued its quiet work. Her energy began to wane. Appearances grew fewer. Her once fiery public voice softened, replaced by a hush that only those closest to her could decipher. And James, ever the stoic, became her shadow, her protector, her constant. Friends say he's different now, gentler, slower. "He doesn't talk much about work anymore," one confidant revealed. "He talks about her garden, her music, her smile." The man who once conquered television and film now finds meaning in the smallest acts: warming her tea, organizing her lyric sheets, reading aloud from the drafts of her 970-page memoir. The tragedy here is not loud. It doesn't scream or shatter. It lingers. It lives in every unfinished sentence, in every glance that holds both gratitude and grief. James has watched the woman he loves become quieter, more fragile, more human. He knows what's coming, though neither of them dares name it. There's a certain sacredness in denial. It protects hope. And so, he keeps their rituals intact. Every night, he still says, "Good night, B." Every morning, she hums the same half-tune she used to test microphones with decades ago. Together, they hold the illusion that routine might be stronger than time. But even devotion has a breaking point. A close friend once said, "When Barbara slows down, James slows down too." He mirrors her rhythm, like he's afraid if he moves too fast, she'll disappear. It's a kind of grief that begins before loss arrives, a slow unraveling of days that look the same on the surface, but beneath are filled with silent preparation. In interviews, James still smiles, still jokes, but his words are weighted. "I'm lucky," he says often. "Every day with her is a good day." It's the kind of statement that sounds cheerful until you realize it's also a farewell rehearsed in pieces. And yet, amid the quiet dread, there's beauty. They've built something few ever find: a love that has outlasted vanity, ego, and spectacle. They don't need the world to understand it. They only need each other to keep choosing it. In the rare public glimpses, an award show here, a brief red carpet there, he stays close to her side, his hand hovering near hers, ready if she stumbles. And she, though slower, still carries the poise of a woman who has lived 1,000 lives in one. Together, they embody a truth few dare to face. Love is not proven in passion, but in presence. James knows that this chapter is different. It's not about winning roles or chasing relevance. It's about witnessing the hardest role of all. He has become the guardian of their silence, the keeper of the final pages they are writing together. Once, when asked if he believed in destiny, he paused and said, "I believe in showing up until the end." Metaphor died. That's what he's doing now, showing up until the end. There's no public statement, No medical confirmation. Just an unspoken understanding that something precious is being protected. The tabloids call it tragedy, but to those who know love in its truest form, it's devotion disguised as grief. Because real tragedy isn't loss. It's the knowing that loss is coming and loving anyway. And so, James stays. He tends the garden, folds the blankets, listens for her voice in the next room. When she hums softly, he smiles. When she forgets a word, he finishes it for her. And every night, before turning off the light, he whispers the same promise he made in 1998. I'm right here, B. Always. The world may never know the full story of Barbara's illness, or how quietly James has chosen love over legacy. But as their days grow slower and their silence deeper, what remains is something rarer than fame grace. In the golden hush of their later years, James Brolin and Barbra Streisand have stepped out of time's spotlight and into something quieter, an existence shaped not by premieres or applause, but by the soft rituals of endurance. The Malibu home that once echoed with laughter, rehearsals, and the distant hum of helicopters now breathes at a slower pace. Mornings unfold in whispers. The world beyond their gate feels like another planet entirely. They have become each other's rhythm. At dawn, James is the first to rise. He brews coffee, folds the paper, and places her glasses by the window seat where she likes to read. Barbra, still meticulous even in her stillness, reviews the notes for her next project. Not a film, not a concert, but the one thing fame never taught her: letting go. Her memoir, My Name is Barbra, was released in 2023, 970 pages of candor, confession, and confrontation. Writing it took nearly a decade, and it reads less like a recollection than an unburdening. Every chapter feels like her way of setting the record straight before silence does it for her. And through it all, James was there, proofreading, listening, sometimes just sitting nearby, waiting for her to look up and smile. He steadies me, she once said. He makes me less afraid of being ordinary. He laughs when he hears that. Because James never saw her as ordinary, not even when she was wrapped in a robe, humming to herself while feeding the dogs. To him, she is still the girl who turned her pain into song. And to her, he is the man who made safety feel romantic. Theirs is not the glamorous Hollywood life people imagine. It's quieter. They rarely host parties. They cook their own dinners. She tends to her roses and writes letters she never sends. He manages small projects, voiceovers, short films, the occasional cameo, but mostly he stays home. When friends ask why, his answer is simple: because that's where my story is. Some nights they still fall into old habits. She at the piano, he nearby with a glass of wine, pretending to read but really just watching her. She'll hum half a melody, glance up, and find him smiling every bit the boy who once stared at James Dean and dreamed of meaning. That's what love becomes. After decades, it's not fire anymore. It's the steady glow that keeps the dark from closing in. Of course, age brings its quiet betrayals. There are doctor visits now, slower walks, forgetful moments. Time has begun to claim the same bodies that once defied it. But neither fights it. They've earned this gentleness. In one interview, James said, "We don't chase time anymore. We let it come to us." It's a sentence that sounds simple until you realize how hard-won it is. When the world sees them now, holding hands at an event, walking arm in arm down a red carpet, the headlines speak of legacy, not celebrity. Hollywood's last love story, they call it. Maybe that's true. In an age where fame burns fast and love burns out faster, their devotion feels almost ancient. Inside their home, the legacy lives in smaller ways. In a framed photograph from their wedding day, her hand midair, his eyes half closed in awe. In a piano that bears the dents of decades. In letters neither has read aloud, tucked away in a drawer labeled private, and though the whispers about illness continue, neither of them fuels the speculation. Barbra once said, "I've been misunderstood my whole life. It's okay if they misunderstand this too." So they stay silent, together. A silence that, for them, has never meant distance. It means trust. Every evening, James closes the curtains and turns off the lights one room at a time. He moves slowly, as if memorizing each corner. At the end of the hallway, Barbra waits, always. And when he reaches her, she looks up from her book and says the same words she said for 27 years. "Ready for bed, honey?" He smiles. Always. Their days may have grown slower, but their love hasn't. In fact, it's only deepened proof that time, when met with tenderness, can polish devotion into something unbreakable. Legends are often remembered for their triumphs, but James Brolin and Barbra Streisand will be remembered for something far rarer, the grace with which they grew old. In a world where fame devours its own, they managed to turn survival into art. Not through spectacle, but through steadiness. Their love story, now stretching beyond 25 years, is not a Hollywood fantasy. It's an antidote to one. When history writes about Barbra Streisand, it will begin, inevitably, with the voice, a sound that defied gravity, gender, and genre. She changed what it meant to sound like a woman, turning fragility into power, precision into passion. She opened the door for generations of artists who were told they didn't fit the mold. Celine Dion once said, "Barbra gave me permission to be both vulnerable and strong." Lady Gaga, too, called her the original fire. Streisand didn't just inspire singers, she taught women in every field that perfectionism could be a weapon if wielded with purpose. But beyond the music, Barbra's cultural impact was revolutionary. She built a fortress of self-definition in an era that demanded submission. Her refusal to change her name, her nose, her accent, all acts of rebellion that predated the vocabulary of empowerment. When the industry slammed its doors, she broke through them, leaving the hinges as reminders. From Yentl to the Prince of Tides and The Mirror Has Two Faces, she wasn't just performing in stories, she was shaping them. Yet, her most lasting contribution may not be cinematic at all. It may be medical. Her founding of the Barbra Streisand Women's Heart Center at Cedars-Sinai changed how medicine treats women. She forced an entire field to confront its biases, and in doing so, saved lives. The girl who once craved affection ended up building systems of care for millions. That is not celebrity. That is legacy. James Brolin's legacy, though quieter, hums with the same integrity. He represents a kind of man that Hollywood rarely produces anymore: steady, unshowy, and deeply human. From Marcus Welby, MD, to Westworld and Hotel, he became the blueprint for dignity on screen. His performances were never about dominance, but about decency. He made ordinary men fascinating, believable, and brave. You can trace his influence in modern television: the father figures who stand firm without bluster, the heroes who speak less but mean more. For actors like Kevin Costner and Mark Harmon, his shadow looms large. And when people recall his calm, they often forget how radical that was in an era addicted to flash. Together, they represent two halves of a paradox: Barbra, the fierce architect of control; James, the quiet guardian of surrender. Between them, a balance few couples ever find. Their partnership redefined what power can look like, not in domination, but in devotion. In interviews, younger stars often call them the last of the old world. But the truth is more haunting. They're the bridge between eras, between studio glamour and authenticity, between the roar of ambition and the whisper of peace. They carry in their union the DNA of classic Hollywood, the glamour, the myth, and the moral courage to outgrow it. Even now, their story circulates through social media in fragments. The three proposals before she said yes, the separate bank accounts, the boardroom bed where they wrote and dreamed. People share these details not because they're gossip, but because they're human. In an age of instant divorces and disposable fame, their endurance feels miraculous. When the lights of Malibu finally dim and the world looks back, this will be their gift. Proof that fame can fade without erasing meaning, that aging can be beautiful when met with grace, and that love, real love, isn't a fairy tale ending, but a discipline. They didn't conquer Hollywood. They outlasted it. But even as their legacies shine brighter with age, the truth remains: behind every triumph lies the question of what it all truly meant. For all the success, all the survival, what do we make of two lives spent in pursuit of both greatness and peace? What makes the story of James Brolin and Barbra Streisand so haunting isn't tragedy in the traditional sense. It's how gracefully they've navigated the inevitability of it. Every human life bends toward loss, but not every life does it with such deliberate tenderness. Their story isn't a cautionary tale. It's a revelation about what love becomes when fame and fear finally get tired of fighting. Barbra's brilliance was never up for debate. She reshaped entire industries with little more than a microphone and a will of iron. But her genius always came at a cost. She spent her life outrunning the ghosts of childhood loneliness, rejection, a mother's silence that echoed louder than applause. She sang because words weren't enough to exorcise the ache. And when the world called her difficult, It was really saying she refused to be small. James, on the other hand, built his legend from the opposite materials. He was quiet where she was commanding, patient where she was precise. He turned struggle into stillness, humility into strength. In Hollywood, a place addicted to noise, his gentleness was radical. When their paths finally crossed, it wasn't destiny in the cinematic sense. It was two lifelong survivors, recognizing the same wound in one another and deciding to stop pretending it didn't hurt. That's what makes them remarkable. They didn't find a perfect love. They created a durable one. The kind that lasts not because it's flawless, but because it forgives. The tabloids love to romanticize the last great Hollywood couple, but that framing misses the point. What Brolin and Streisand have isn't nostalgia, it's proof of evolution. They came from a world that told men to dominate and women to submit, and they rewrote the script. Two fully realized people walking side by side, never above or below the other. And yet, their devotion carries a melancholy weight. You can feel it in James's interviews, the way he pauses before mentioning her name, the soft crack in his voice when he says, "Every day with her is a good day." You can see it in her recent absences, the fragility in her stillness. Their love has entered its final act, and both of them know it. What we're witnessing isn't tragedy, it's transformation. The glamour has faded, but the truth has never been clearer. That after all the roles, the songs, the awards, and the decades, what truly matters isn't what you built, but who you built it with. There's something profoundly human about that realization. It strips away all pretense. It reminds us that greatness, at its core, is not about standing above others, but about standing beside someone when the lights go out. And that's why this story hits deeper than gossip ever could. Because we all age, we all lose. We all learn, eventually, that love isn't a crescendo, it's an echo that lingers long after the music stops. Barbara and James have spent their lives teaching the world what resilience looks like. But maybe their final lesson is the most important one, that peace isn't found in applause or immortality. It's found in knowing you showed up for someone completely until the very end. That's not just a love story, it's a legacy. But as their twilight deepens, there's one final chapter left, the reflection, the haunting silence after the curtain falls. Because even when stories end, their echoes never truly fade. Some stories don't end, they simply dim, like candlelight after a long evening, flickering until it becomes memory. James Brolin and Barbra Streisand's story is one of them. It doesn't close with loss, but with the kind of peace most people spend their lives searching for and never find. In the quiet of their Malibu home, there are no spotlights, no rehearsals, no roaring audiences, only the sound of the Pacific breathing against the shore and two lives that have finally learned how to rest. The world that once demanded so much of them now feels like a faraway dream. They no longer perform for applause. They live for the stillness between breaths. Every great love story is, in the end, an act of surrender. Not the surrender of will, but of ego. The acknowledgement that nothing lasts forever, and that's what makes it sacred. Barbara has said she no longer fears aging. She fears missing the beauty hidden inside it. James, who once battled time by outworking it, now welcomes each day like a gift wrapped in soft inevitability. Sometimes neighbors say they see them walking together at dusk. She moves slowly, her hand looped through his arm. He stays one step behind, not leading her, just there, steady, watchful, present. They talk, sometimes laugh, sometimes say nothing at all. Silence has always been their shared language, the same silence that raised him and silenced her. Now it's the thread that binds them. Inside, her piano remains uncovered, its keys still touched by evening light. Some nights, when the wind hums just right, she'll play the melody she wrote for him on their wedding day. He knows every note by heart. The song doesn't end. It simply trails off, like the horizon swallowing the sun. That's how love ends too, not in a grand finale, but in a gentle fading. One hand reaching for another, one heart whispering, "Still here." Their legacy will outlive their bodies. Not just in films or records, but in the invisible example they've left behind, the idea that love isn't measured in years or achievements, but in the quiet choice to keep showing up when the world grows dim. They have become, without meaning to, symbols of endurance in an era that has forgotten what commitment looks like. And perhaps that's the bittersweet miracle of their story. They've turned the mundane tea, bedtime, conversation into devotion. They've turned aging into art. Someday, long after the Malibu tides have erased their footprints, people will still whisper about them. Not for scandal, not for fame, but for the impossible tenderness of two souls who found each other at the edge of time and refused to let go. When future generations look back at the era of Hollywood giants, they'll find a pattern: bright lights, fast rises, dramatic falls. And then, somewhere in the margins, they'll find these two names written softly side by side. Proof that even in a world built on illusion, something real can survive. Because in the end, love is not performance. It's preservation. It's remembering the sound of someone's breath beside yours and realizing that, for a while, you didn't just exist, you were understood. And perhaps that's what James Brolin and Barbra Streisand have given us. Not just a history, but a hope. That we might all one day find a love that burns quietly, faithfully, without spectacle, and that we'll have the courage to keep it alive until the very last page. Some stories were never meant to be known, but now,